Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to look at Chapter 26, Part 3, Cultural Continuity and Change in East Asia. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the two following questions. 1. How did the Qing dynasty represent both change and continuity in the Chinese imperial order, Chinese imperial culture? And how did East Asian societies adapt to European influence during this time? So let us talk about Ming, Qing, China. So one of the things worth noting right away was that the Qing conquest of the Ming dynasty took a really long time. It took a good 10 years for the Qing to solidify their rule over the Ming, in part because they did not initially plan to conquer all of China. But that is what ended up happening. But it was incredibly violent, with almost 800,000 deaths over that time. And so it's really important to understand that once the Qing were in charge, they saw it as their most important duty to restore balance, restore order, and sort of pick up the pieces from this incredibly violent change in government. The women in society remained restricted. So from the Song dynasty, with the exception of the Yuan dynasty, the Ming dynasty retained many of those earlier restrictions on female autonomy. Footbinding remained a very common practice, although Qing women did not bind their feet. And widows were encouraged not to remarry in an effort to preserve their chastity. This became a very common concern around society. Confucian scholars and court scholars, known as mandarins, continued to dominate life, and the worship of the emperors continued. This is something that had been begun during the Song dynasty, and it may have predated the Song dynasty. And this continued. This wasn't interrupted. The civil service exam was retained and continued to be used. And the Qing emperors did settle down in the Forbidden City. So for the most part, the Qing did adopt to standard Chinese culture. Although they continued to maintain their Manchu, their Qing language, and they continued to go on very long, very extravagant, sometimes very expensive royal hunts as a way to remain connected with their nomadic heritage. The Mongols did this too, and so this is something that has been seen every time a non-Chinese dynasty rules China. So the Qing, like I said before, they had to do a somewhat of a delicate balance of power. Being that they were not Han Chinese, they were, instead of portraying themselves as the son of heaven, they portrayed themselves as the unifiers under heaven. And so instead of the Han Chinese being the superior people of the entire world, the Qing dynasty sort of portrayed themselves as the unifiers. They brought together the Han Chinese and the other non-Han peoples and the empire, the Mongolians, the Tibetans, Muslim Chinese. They would bring together everybody, and so the Qing sort of portrayed themselves as unifiers. They were on top. Don't mistake it, but nonetheless, they were the ones who are going to bring everybody together, and this is sort of how they're going to legitimize their rule. And they continued to patronize Chinese culture. It's not like they neglected Chinese culture, and in particular, it's during this time that the 4 Chinese classic novels, which are if I'm remembering them all correctly, it is the Dream of the Red Chamber, Water Margin, Journey to the West, and The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which became required knowledge for the civil service exams. It's during this time that these books are canonized and standardized. Of course, they've been around for a very long time, but it's during this time that they're made into their official versions that we have today. And it's also during the early Qing dynasty that we do witness an exploration of philosophy and political ideas in China, almost sort of akin to an enlightenment in Europe, although there are some big asterisks that come with that statement. But for example, Huang Chongxi critiqued the absolutism of the Ming emperors. He was a scholar from southern China, and he argued that the Ming emperors had abused their power in arguments that would be very similar to, say, John Locke. Although it's worth noting, he critiqued the Ming emperors after the Ming dynasty was gone. So it's not like he exactly had to fear anything from the emperors. And you had other scholars, such as Yan Yuan, who critiqued Neo-Confucian values as not really practical. And whereas Neo-Confucianism had been created to counter Buddhism with its metaphysics, this scholar in particular argued that Confucian values ought to go back to their practical principles about how you organize society. So there was some questioning of the status quo in what you could call an enlightenment, but nothing that really fundamentally shifted, the values in the culture. In Japan, you also see sort of some cultural shifts, in particular with the unification of the country. Once the warring period states is over, the samurai don't really have a job anymore. The invasion of Korea was sort of meant to channel some of that energy, but the invasion of Korea failed. And so there were really no more wars to fight. And so what we begin to see is the transition from samurais as warriors to samurais as bureaucrats. And this is not to say that samurai did not continue to see themselves as warriors and to maintain their swords and their estates. But now there were fewer wars to fight. And so we begin to see a term of high status bureaucrats. We call them salaried samurais. These are samurai that got paid a salary. They actually got paid in rice, which was a common medium of exchange in Japan during this time. So they got paid in rice. So if you think you're not getting paid a lot, I mean, imagine getting paid in rice. During this time in Japan, we also begin to see something called the rise of native learning, which is an attempt by scholars to sort of find what is Japanese. So while Confucian values and Buddhism had taken hold in Japan, and Buddhism in particular was very, very popular, Buddhism had so intertwined itself with the indigenous Japanese religion of Shintoism that by this time, in the early 1600s, it was almost impossible to tell the two apart. But during this time, a number of scholars attempt to sort of disentangle them, almost like unsyncretize. And we talk about syncretism all the time, but this is literally an attempt to desyncretize them and pull apart and isolate Shintoism and isolate what is truly Japanese in the religion. And this will lead to something called state Shintoism later on in Japanese history. We also get to see urban growth. And so we see the rise of big cities and the population explosion that came with that. We see what are called floating worlds, which are pleasure districts in the capital city, called floating worlds because you literally leave your cares behind and just float away. We also see the rise of something called Kabuki theater, which is still really popular in Japan today, which represents a break with the highly stylized dramas of the past influenced by Chinese literature, and instead using improvised stories and local Japanese traditions. And so in general, we begin to see sort of a looking inward and an attempt to find things that are uniquely Japanese during this time in Japan. So let's talk really quick about science and technology in China. So during this time, both the Ming and the Qing focused primarily on social stability. We haven't talked about this yet because we haven't covered the Industrial Revolution yet, but typically when there's big changes in production, sometimes this can lead to huge shifts in displacements in society, and this can lead to social instability. One need only think of the deindustrialization occurring that has occurred across the United States to think about the social instability that can result from that. And so while there was not per se a scientific revolution in China, this doesn't mean that science did not continue. Water-powered machines and looms continued to be built and used. Iron furnaces continued to proliferate. Firearm technology was improved. It was copied from Europeans and continued to be built upon. But in some ways, it is possible to say that what some scholars have termed blocked technological development. And what that means is that there is sort of, you eventually hit a wall when you don't have a unified field of science, right? You can only make so many improvements by observation. When you don't understand the fundamentals, your understanding kind of hits a wall. And so some scholars have made the case that there was a lack of a unified field of science, sort of the way there was with math and physics in Europe. And some scholars have pointed out that those who were doing scientific research, like astronomers at the Royal Astronomies, were not people on the margins of society. They did not have an investment in overturning the worldview as it was. Now, that is not to say that eventually European scholars did not eventually have a motive. They were also eventually patronized by royals. One need only think of Tycho Brahe and his Danish observatory that was built for him by the king. But in Europe, scholars sort of had an investment and an incentive to upturn the existing order. And later they would even be supported by their kings and queens to do this. Now, the kings and queens didn't do this altruistically, of course. They had their own motivations. But that was not the case in China. There was no motivation to overturn the old order. And this is not because people were ignorant or not curious, but the emphasis was on stability, right? That's part of the reason why. It's very complicated, and I'm giving a very brief overview. If you were to ask the question, why there was not a scientific revolution in China, you could teach an entire course on that. And I'm giving a very rough overview here, but nonetheless, there was what seemed to be a lack of scientific progress in China during the time. And probably a good example of this was that the Song Dynasty had water clocks. They built machines that could tell time via the running of water, whereas in the Ming Dynasty, when they were shown European clocks, showed no interest in these clocks. And the Song Dynasty clocks had long since disappeared. So what was the response to this increasing European influence as it began to show itself in East Asia? Well, in general, if Asians were interested at all in European technology or science, it was only to the extent that it was military technology, especially when it came to guns. The Japanese, for example, were very keen to copy the Portuguese firearms, the Tangashima. But in general, they just terribly weren't interested in clocks or weights or anything along those lines. A lot of the basic science already existed in many of these states. They already had furnaces and looms. They didn't really need anything. But the improvements in firearms were welcomed by most states. In terms of Christianity, it also didn't make a lot of inroads, at least not in China. There was a famous preacher named Matteo Ricci who attempted to gain a lot of converts in China by blending Christianity with Chinese practices, which kind of worked, but the Pope eventually said, no, you can't do that. That's blasphemy, and sort of stopped his converting. And so in general, apart from a few court nobles and a few scholars, Christianity really didn't have much of a hold in China during this time. Japan was sort of the other side of that. Christianity was very popular in Japan for a little while. You even had samurai and local lords converting to Christianity. And so, for example, you have you have the samurai Tsunenaga, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, who eventually went and met the Pope, which was pretty unusual. And you have sort of a unique version of Japanese Christianity called Kirishitan, to describe this group of Christians. So not very popular in China, but does gain a bit of a foothold in Japan, at least for a little while. However, this doesn't last terribly long. I think I mentioned in an earlier video that the shogun was suspicious of the Spanish, as well as the fact that a group of Christians led a revolt against the shogun. This led to the shogun deciding that he was going to remove all Christians from Japan. Now, Christianity did survive in secret, but officially it was gone, and the only Christians allowed in the country were the Dutch, who continued to trade in Nagasaki. In particular, though, because the Dutch version of Christianity, which is called Calvinism, does not seek converts. They're not trying to convert people. This is in part why the Dutch were allowed to kind of take over the Portuguese trading rights. China also tried to prevent European influence, although to a much, much lesser successful degree. So, for example, in 1651, one of the emperors put out a decree that said everybody has to move 10 miles inland. And of course, nobody did that. Local governors were not able to successfully implement that order. Smuggling continued. Piracy continued. In fact, at this time, we saw the largest pirate fleet ever assembled under Madame Chang. So if we had to sum up the Asian response to European influence in China and Japan, there was definitely an effort, a definite curiosity, but an effort to control and limit the spread of new cultural ideas that could have been dangerous, in order to keep their societies stable after long periods or short, intense periods of instability during this time. So you should be able to answer those two questions from the beginning of the video. I want to thank you for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.